set down her spoon without a sound, and no one at the table noticed. That was the thing about the Voss household. No one noticed anything that didn't directly concern them. It had been 3 years since Clara Voss. Clara Fairweather, she still thought of herself some mornings in that half-awake moment before the day fully arrived, had come to live in this house on Aldermore Road. 3 years of dinners like this one, with the chandelier throwing gold light across the good china and conversation moving around her like water around a stone. Present, untouched, she carries herself like a woman who expects to be admired. Dorothea Voss said, refilling her own wine-glass without offering it to anyone else. She was speaking to her son, but she angled the words outward, the way a woman does when she wants the room to hear. It doesn't suit a plain face. The table went quiet in the particular way it always did when Dorothea spoke about Clara, not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of people deciding how interested they were in watching. Clara's husband, Thomas, turned his wine-glass slowly on the tablecloth. He did not look up. She had stopped waiting for him to look up. What Clara did instead, and she would think about this later, in the dark, with her trunk half-packed and the candle burning low, was reach for the bread-basket. Calmly, as though she had heard nothing more interesting than the weather report, she tore a small piece, brought it to her lips, and chewed it slowly while Dorothea watched her with that particular expression she had, the one that looked like satisfaction wearing the costume of concern. "I only mean," Dorothea continued, setting down her glass, "that some women are fortunate in other ways, in character, in usefulness. A plain woman who knows her place is a gift to her household." Thomas cleared his throat. Mother. One word. That was all he ever managed. One word, like a hand waved at smoke. The gesture of a man who wanted credit for the attempt without the cost of the effort. Clara looked at him then, really looked. Across the candles and the silver, and the careful arrangement of things that were supposed to signal a good life. He was not unkind. That was the most she had ever been able to say about Thomas Voss. And some nights she had said it to herself like a prayer, trying to make it enough. He was not unkind. He simply was not there. Not for her. Not in any of the ways that mattered. He had married her because his mother needed the Fairweather name attached to this family's land dispute, and because Clara had been 22 and without other prospects, and because the Fairweather solicitor had drawn up a contract that benefited everyone except the woman at the center of it. She had known this. She had married him anyway. That was the part she never let herself forget. "You're very quiet tonight, Clara," Dorothea said, and there was almost something like a smile in it. "I'm listening," Clara said. "You always have a great deal to say." It wasn't rude. It was perfectly pleasant. That was the genius of it, and Dorothea knew it, and the knowing made her eyes go flat for just a moment before her expression rearranged itself. Thomas almost smiled. Clara caught it from the corner of her eye, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, and felt something close to grief. Because there he was, briefly, the man she might have learned to love if he had ever been willing to be that man in full daylight. She excused herself before dessert. In her room, she sat at the edge of the bed for a long time. The trunk was in the wardrobe. A good trunk, solid leather with brass fittings. It had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that. It had made 2 ocean crossings and a train journey through 4 states. It was, Clara had always privately felt, the most dependable thing she owned. She pulled it out. She did not allow herself to think too much about what she was doing. Thinking too much was how she had stayed 3 years longer than she should have. She began with practical things. 2 good dresses, her winter coat, even though it was May, because she did not know how long she would be traveling. Her writing box with the letters from her sister Nora in it. Nora, who lived in Cincinnati now, who had written 6 months ago to say there is always a room here if you need it. No questions asked. At the time Clara had folded the letter back into its envelope and told herself she would not need it. She needed it now. She wrapped her mother's cameo brooch in a handkerchief and tucked it in the corner of the trunk where it would not shift. She took the small amount of money she had been quietly, carefully saving from the household accounts for the past 18 months. Not stealing, she told herself, because she had managed those accounts entirely and the savings had been hers to find, an arrangement she had never explained to Thomas, who did not ask about the household accounts because numbers bored him. She did not take anything that was not hers. This seemed important. She wanted to be able to say that clearly if anyone ever asked. By 2:30 in the morning, the house was deeply asleep. Dorothea's room was at the opposite end of the hall, and she wore earplugs against the noise of the street. Thomas slept heavily, the way men do when they have no unresolved things keeping them awake. Clara, dressed in her traveling clothes, buttoned her coat and put on her gloves. She carried the trunk herself to the top of the stairs, then bumped it down one step at a time, slowly, controlling the weight of it. It made almost no sound on the carpeted runner. She had planned this. She had thought about the stairs. At the bottom, she set it down and looked back up into the dark. There was nothing up there she wanted enough to go back for. She wrote one letter, which she left on the hall table, weighted under the silver card tray. It was addressed to Thomas. It said in full, "Thomas, I am returning to my family. I have taken only what is mine. The household accounts are in order and the ledger is on the desk in the study. I wish you well. Clara." She did not say she was sorry. She was not sorry. She was not sorry. She was, if she was honest, only sorry she had not done it sooner. The front door clicked shut behind her at 10 minutes past 3. The street was empty and smelled of lilac from the neighbor's hedge, and the sky was doing that thing it does before dawn. Not dark anymore, not yet light, some in-between color that has no name. Clara stood on the step for one moment, her trunk beside her, and breathed it in. Then she walked to the corner and hailed the first cab she saw. Thomas found the letter at 7:15. He read it standing in the hall in his dressing gown, and then he read it again, and then he sat down on the bottom step of the stairs, the way Clara had done many times after difficult evenings, though he did not know that, because he had never been the kind of man who noticed where his wife sat when she was unhappy. His mother appeared at the top of the stairs at 7:30, hair pinned, already dressed, already herself in the full and formidable way she was every morning before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. "What are you doing sitting on the stairs?" she said. He held up the letter. Dorothea came down and took it from him and read it. And when she finished, she handed it back with an expression Thomas could not immediately interpret. Not triumph. Not distress. Something more complicated than either. "Well," she said, "that's all you have to say." "I have a great deal to say," Dorothea replied, going toward the kitchen. "I'm choosing to say it after breakfast." Thomas went to the study. The household ledger was on the desk, exactly as Clara had said. He opened it and looked at the columns of figures, careful, precise, complete, and felt the specific shame of a man who has benefited enormously from someone's competence while never once acknowledging it. He turned to the back pages where Clara had made notes in her small, neat handwriting, notations about the spring repairs, a list of suppliers, a reminder about the insurance on the East Field, which was up for renewal in June and which Thomas had entirely forgotten about. He closed the ledger. He put his hands flat on the desk. He stared at the wall. At some point, he was not sure how much time passed. His mother appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him in the chair that Clara had always used when she came to discuss household matters. Dorothea looked at the chair and then at her son and did not comment on either. "She took the morning train," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. He had sent the stable boy to inquire at the station, and the answer had come back quickly. "Where to?" "Cincinnati." Her sister. Dorothea wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside, the gardener was arriving. The sound of the gate a small punctuation in the quiet. "I was unkind to her," Dorothea said finally, not confessing it, exactly, more the way a person states a practical fact they have been avoiding. Thomas looked at her. "Don't look at me like that. I'm aware of my own behavior, Thomas. I simply chose not to examine it too closely while it was convenient not to." She set down the cup. She was a sensible woman. Competent, better than this house deserved, I think, if I am being honest, which I prefer not to be before noon, but here we are. It was the most his mother had ever said about Clara. Possibly the most honest thing Thomas had heard her say about anything. "What do I do?" he said. Dorothea looked at him for a long time. "What do you want to do?" He didn't answer immediately, which was, she thought, watching him. Perhaps the first honest thing he had done in quite a while. Nora's house in Cincinnati was 3 stories, warm and slightly chaotic in the way of homes where children live. Clara arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with her trunk and the tiredness behind her eyes that she suspected was not the kind sleep would fix. Nora opened the door before Clara had finished knocking. She was taller than Clara, broader, with their father's red hair gone darker now, and she looked at her sister's face and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. "Come in," she said, taking one side of the trunk. "I made soup." Clara slept for 14 hours the first night. She was not sure she had ever slept that long in her life. She woke to the sound of children somewhere below and the smell of coffee, and the particular quality of light that comes through windows with no heavy drapes. Bright, unapologetic, not arranged to impress anyone. She lay still for a moment, listening to the house. It was a house full of ordinary noise. Chairs scraping. A dog somewhere. One of the children asking a question in a voice that carried without intending to. Nora's husband George laughing at something. Clara pressed her face into the pillow and cried, briefly and without quite meaning to, and then felt considerably better. She was at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee when Nora sat across from her and said, "Tell me what you want. Not what happened. Not what did he do. What do you want?" Clara thought about it. She had not been asked that question in some time. "I want to work," she said. "I want to be useful in a way that has my name on it. I want—" She stopped. Started again. "I manage that entire household. The accounts, the staff, the repairs, the contracts. I would like to do that for something that belongs to me." Nora nodded as though this was the most reasonable thing she had ever heard. "George's firm has a client," she said. "A widow, Mrs. Pruitt. She has a boarding house on Elm Street, does very well, but her bookkeeper retired in March and she's been managing it herself and she hates it. George mentioned you might be—" "Yes," Clara said. Nora smiled. "I haven't finished." "Yes, anyway." The letter from Thomas arrived in the 3rd week. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she'd fully taken it from Nora's hands. She stood in the hallway for a moment with it, and then went to her room and sat in the chair by the window and opened it. It was not what she expected. She had expected apology, or arguments about the Fairweather land contract, which she knew was still unresolved, which she suspected was the real reason he had written. Men like Thomas did not write letters for emotional reasons. They wrote because something practical required it. But this letter was strange. It was a man writing who was not accustomed to writing honestly, trying very hard to do it anyway, and the effort showed in every line. He wrote about finding the ledger, about the insurance renewal she had flagged, about sitting in the study for a long time afterward trying to understand how he had missed so much. "I don't know when I stopped seeing you as a person I had chosen," he wrote, "and started seeing you as a fixed feature of the household. I think it happened slowly enough that I didn't notice. I'm telling you this not to excuse it, but because you deserve to hear that I know it happened." He did not ask her to come back. He did not mention the land. He said, near the end, that Dorothea had made a specific point of asking him to include something, and then, in slightly different handwriting, neater, more deliberate, there was one sentence: "She managed that household better than anyone we have had, and she managed it with more grace than she was owed." D.V. Clara read that line 3 times. It was not an apology exactly. With Dorothea Voss, perhaps it was the closest thing possible. She folded the letter and held it in her lap, and looked out at the street below, where a woman was walking a large, badly behaved dog, and a boy was selling newspapers on the corner, and the ordinary world was going about its ordinary business. She thought about Thomas in that hallway, reading her note. She thought about him sitting on the bottom step. She thought about the curtsy she had not given anyone, because she had not been the kind of woman who performed submission for an audience. She had simply left, and leaving had felt, in the doing of it, like the most articulate thing she had ever said. She did not write back that day. She went to Mrs. Prowitt's boarding house on Elm Street and spent 3 hours with the accounts and came home with ink on her fingers and a list of 12 things that needed reorganizing, and felt, for the first time in a long time, specifically and precisely herself. Thomas came in person 6 weeks later. He did not bring his mother. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she looked out the window and saw him on the street below, standing with his hat in his hands, looking at the door of Nora's house as though he had been standing there for some time already. She watched him for a moment before she went down. He looked different, not dramatically. Men like Thomas did not change dramatically, but he looked like a man who had been doing some uncomfortable thinking and had not yet decided whether the thinking would lead anywhere, and she recognized this because she had spent years watching him carefully enough to read the small differences. Nora answered the door before Clara reached the bottom of the stairs. She heard her sister say, very pleasantly, "You can wait in the parlor," and the particular weight of that "can" was a gift. Clara came into the parlor, and Thomas stood up immediately, and she saw that he had taken off his hat and was holding it in both hands, and he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Or perhaps she had seen it, briefly, rarely, in the early months, before the household had swallowed them both in its routines and had stopped expecting to see it again. "I won't take much of your time," he said, which was either a lie or a kindness. She wasn't sure which. "Sit down, Thomas." He sat. She sat across from him, the same distance as the dinner table, though it felt nothing like the dinner table. "I'm not coming back," she said first, because it seemed important to establish, not as cruelty, as clarity. He nodded slowly. "I know. I'm not. I'm not here to ask you to. I wanted to." He stopped. He was not good at this. He had never pretended to be good at this, which was one of the few honest things about him. "I wanted to say it in person. What I wrote." "You wrote it very well." He almost smiled. "My mother edited the first draft." Clara looked at him. "She edited it. She said the first version sounded like a man apologizing for a business inconvenience. She wasn't wrong." Clara thought about Dorothea Voss sitting across from her son with a draft letter and a pen, crossing out lines. The image was so improbable that it almost worked. "I want to understand something," Clara said. "Not for your sake, for mine." She looked at him steadily. "Did you marry me because of the land?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide to be honest, and she recognized the decision. The small shift of a man choosing the harder thing. "Partly," he said. "The contract was advantageous. My solicitor was very clear about it." He looked down at the hat in his hands. "But I thought you were the kind of woman a man could build something with." "I believed that. I simply never—" He stopped again. "I never showed you that I believed it. And after a while I think you stopped believing I did." There it was, the thing she had needed to hear, not because it changed anything, but because it made the marriage real in a way it had sometimes failed to feel, a real thing, with real weight, that two real people had mismanaged. "That's true," she said. "I know." They sat for a moment in the quiet of Nora's parlor, which smelled of furniture polish and the soup she had put on for lunch and the particular aliveness of a house that was actually fully lived in. "The land contract," Clara said. "The eastern boundary dispute. Still unresolved. My solicitor believes it will require. I know what it requires. I read every document." She had. He knew she had. "There's a surveyor's record from 1841 in the county office that resolves the question entirely. Your solicitor hasn't found it because he's been looking at the wrong county. The property transferred jurisdictions in 1839. Thomas stared at her. "The Fairweather land was always legally separate from the Voss claim," she continued. "My father knew it. That's why he agreed to the marriage contract. He knew the boundary question was already settled in our favor, and the marriage would simply confirm a relationship that existed regardless. She paused. You didn't need to marry me for the land, Thomas. The land was never in question. He sat very still. Your solicitor charged you handsomely for not finding that out, Clara said, not unkindly. Factually, I would suggest a different solicitor. Thomas put his hat on his knee and looked at her in a way she had not expected and did not quite know how to name. Something between admiration and a particular kind of grief. You knew this, he said. When you married me, you knew the land question was already resolved. Yes, and you married me anyway. My father arranged it. I was 22. I didn't have a great deal of... She stopped, started again with the more honest version. I was curious about you. I thought perhaps a man who needed things from a marriage might become a man who valued what he'd been given. She looked at him evenly. I was wrong about the timeline. He absorbed this. Outside, one of Nora's children ran past the window laughing at something. I'm glad you left, Thomas said finally, and it sounded like it cost him something. I want you to know that, not because I wanted you gone. Because I think if you hadn't, I would have gone on not understanding what I'd had. Clara nodded slowly. She believed him. That was the unexpected part. She actually believed him. What happens now, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. More a thing she was turning over in her hands. I don't know, Thomas said. I think that depends on you. He looked up. I think everything from this point forward depends on you. She thought about Mrs. Prowett's boarding house, and the accounts with her name on the ledger, and the window in her room at Nora's that let in the morning light. She thought about what it meant to be known. Not perfectly, not completely, but seen, at least. Seen trying. She thought about Thomas sitting on the bottom stair at 7:15 in the morning with a letter in his hands. I'm not coming back to Aldermore Road, she said. No, he agreed. If there is anything to discuss, the two of us, it begins here, from this point, not from where we were. Yes, he said. And this time it was not one word waved at smoke. It was a man meaning a thing fully, with the particular weight of someone who had thought about it long enough to understand what he was agreeing to. It was not a reconciliation. Not that day. But it was the first conversation they had ever had where both of them were entirely present in the room, and that felt to Clara like something worth noting. She stood, and he stood, and she walked him to the door of Nora's house where the afternoon light was coming down the street in long warm bars, and she shook his hand, because she was not yet ready for more than that, and he understood, and did not push, and she watched him walk back down the street toward wherever he had left his carriage. She stood in the doorway for a moment after he turned the corner. Then she went back inside to the kitchen, where Nora was stirring soup and pretending she had not been listening, and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at the table with her ledger from Mrs. Pruitt's, and got back to work.